Welcome back to the podcast at Philippe, and you know what that means. Another deep dive. Today we're looking at some fascinating news sources about none other than Donald Trump and all the buzz he's been generating since his inauguration back on January 21st. I mean, you'd think after all these years in the spotlight, he'd maybe tone it down a little bit. Nope. This week alone, we've got him saying the government is practically running a safe house for criminals.
And not just any criminals. He specifically claims they're mentally ill and came here illegally.
Yeah, talk about a loaded statement. Then on top of that, he goes and throws out the FBI's crime stats, calls them all lies.
Which is especially wild considering the FBI's own data shows homicides actually decreased these past couple of years.
It just makes you wonder, what's the angle here?
Well, I think it's safe to say there's a strategy at play. You know, this idea of the government failing to protect its own people, that really taps into people's fears, especially when you tie it to immigration.
So it's like he's creating this problem, even if it doesn't really exist.
Right, and then positioning himself as the only one who can fix it.
Classic move. And speaking of creating problems, what about this migrant crime wave he keeps talking about? Again, the national data just doesn't back that up.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how rhetoric, how the way you frame something can create a narrative that's completely detached from reality.
But it's a powerful narrative nonetheless, especially for those already predisposed to certain beliefs.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what makes it so dangerous. You start connecting crime to a specific group, in this case, migrants, and it creates a scapegoat.
Diverts attention from the real, more complex issues at play.
Precisely. And we saw this same playbook during his previous presidency, too.
Oh, for sure. It's a recurring theme.
Yeah.
Fear, urgency, identify an enemy, and bam, you're the hero who can save the day. Speaking of narratives, let's talk about his inauguration speech.
Yes. Let's just say it wasn't exactly a shining beacon of truth.
It was like a fact checker's worst nightmare.
Full of inaccuracies, misleading statements, the whole 9 yards.
And it's not even new for him, right? This tendency to bend reality, it's been a hallmark of his career.
Oh, absolutely. He's always operated under his own set of facts, even when they directly contradict expert opinions and solid data.
So we've got all that going on domestically, but then he steps onto the world stage. And things get even more interesting, shall we say. First, he drops this bombshell on NATO, demanding they up their defense spending to 5% of GDP.
A pretty significant jump from the current 2% target. It sparked a lot of debate, with some members viewing it as completely unreasonable.
And then we have the whole Spain incident, where he threatens 100% tariffs on their exports because of their supposedly low defense contributions. The only problem is,
he thought Spain was part of the BRICS economic bloc, which it's not.
I mean, you got to laugh, right? But it also makes you wonder, how much does he actually understand about international relations?
It's a bit concerning, to say the least. These kinds of slip-ups on the global stage, they can have serious consequences.
No kidding. Okay, so back to domestic policy. We touched on the FEMA comments earlier, but there's this whole other thread he keeps pulling on about crime being linked to mental illness.
And not just that, but this idea that other countries are deliberately sending their criminals and mentally ill to the U.S.
Which, let's be clear, there's absolutely no evidence to support.
None whatsoever. It's pure fear-mongering and prejudice.
Again, creating a problem to then be the hero who solves it.
It's a pattern we're seeing again and again, and it's especially damaging because it reinforces harmful stereotypes about mental illness.
Linking it directly to criminal behavior when the reality is far more nuanced.
Exactly. Mental illness is complex, it's multifaceted. To just say it equals crime is not only inaccurate, but deeply stigmatizing.
So, big picture, what are we seeing here?
Well, I think it's clear we're seeing classic populist tactics at play. Appeal to fear, simplify complex issues, and position yourself as the strong leader who can protect everyone.
And clearly it resonates with some people. But for the rest of us, how do we navigate this world where facts are constantly being challenged and rhetoric often trumps truth?
It's a challenge, no question. But I think the first step is awareness. We need to be more conscious of the information we're taking in, where it's coming from, and what the motivations behind it might be.
So becoming more critical consumers of information, especially in this age of social media where misinformation spreads like wildfire.
Exactly. We can't just take things at face value. We have to check sources, look for evidence, consider different perspectives.
Like being a detective. Always questioning, always investigative.
Precisely. But it's not just about being critical, it's about being proactive too. We can't let misinformation run rampant. We have to speak up, challenge falsehoods, and promote accurate information.
So engaging in those tough conversations, even when we disagree.
Absolutely. Being open to learning, to changing our minds when presented with new evidence.
And recognizing that this is a constant process.
The information landscape is always evolving. We have to adapt along with it.
It can feel overwhelming, but it's also empowering to know we have the power to be informed, engaged citizens. We're not just passive recipients of information. We can actively seek out truth and hold those in power accountable.
Couldn't agree more.
Well said.
Now, before we get too deep down this rabbit hole, let's take a step back for a moment. And when we come back, we'll delve into some of the international implications of Trump's recent actions. And don't forget, you can subscribe to Le Podcast de Philippe on YouTube and like this video for more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics.
Welcome back to the Podcast de Philippe. Before we went on to other things, we were talking about Donald Trump's statements since his inauguration and really trying to get a handle on what all this rhetoric means.
Yeah, and there's one comment in particular that kind of stuck with me, the one about Kim Jong-un. You know, even with those denuclearization talks going nowhere, he still says he wants to meet with him.
Right, and he even called him a smart guy.
It just seems odd given all the history there between the U.S. and North Korea. It's left a lot of people scratching their heads, that's for sure. I mean, you could see it as a sign he's open to diplomacy and maybe extending an olive branch.
Sure.
But knowing how Trump's operated in the past and with no real movement on denuclearization, it's tough to view it as anything more than a gesture, something for the cameras.
It makes you wonder what he's really after. If anything, is it about actual diplomacy or just another publicity stunt?
Hard to say definitively, but it does highlight how complicated, how unpredictable things can be on the world stage.
For sure.
The stakes are high, that's for sure. Every word, every move can have huge ripple effects globally.
Absolutely. So we've seen him make these bold claims, disregard data, and really stir the pot internationally. But what about back home, domestically? We talked about his comments on FEMA, but there's this other theme that keeps popping up, this idea of crime being tied to mental illness.
And that other countries are purposely sending their criminals, their mentally ill people, to the U.S.
Which, let's just state for the record, there's zero evidence to back that up.
None at all. It plays on fear and prejudice, plain and simple.
So we're back to that same playbook, right? Create a problem where there isn't one, then swoop in as the savior.
Exactly. And by linking crime to mental illness, it perpetuates harmful stereotypes.
Makes people who are already vulnerable even more so.
Exactly. It sends a dangerous message, and it can have serious real-world consequences. More marginalization, more discrimination against those struggling with mental health.
It just doesn't add up.
And it's important to remember, just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean one causes the other.
Right. Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Mental illness is complex. To say it's the root of criminal behavior, that's just irresponsible.
Seems like there's a pattern emerging here. Create a problem, even if it's not really a problem, then position yourself as the only one who can solve it.
You're picking up on the underlying strategy. Classic populism. Appeal to fear, offer simple solutions for complicated issues, and present yourself as the strong leader, the protector.
And it's working, at least for some people. But what about the rest of us? How do we navigate this world where facts are up for debate and rhetoric seems to drown out the truth?
It's a tough one, that's for sure. But I think it starts with awareness. Being conscious of the information we consume, where it's coming from, what the agenda might be.
So being more critical of the information we take in, especially with social media amplifying everything.
Absolutely. We can't just take things at face value anymore, especially from those in positions of power or those pushing a particular agenda.
We have to dig deeper.
Check those sources, look for evidence, and try to see things from different angles.
Like being a detective, always questioning, always looking for the truth.
Exactly. But it's not just about being critical, it's about being proactive. We can't just let misinformation spread. We have to speak up, challenge those falsehoods, and promote accurate information.
So having those uncomfortable conversations, even when people disagree.
Exactly. Being open to learning, being willing to change our minds when presented with new evidence.
And knowing that it's a constant process.
The information landscape is changing all the time. We have to change with it.
It can be overwhelming, no doubt. But there's also a sense of empowerment in knowing we can be informed, that we can engage, that we're not just sitting back and taking it all in. We can seek out the truth and hold those in power accountable.
I couldn't agree more.
And we're back for the final stretch here on Le Podcast de Philippe, wrapping up our deep dive into the world of Donald Trump's latest statements.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
Definitely. From those wild claims about crime and immigration to his interesting takes on foreign policy and everything in between. But one thing's for sure, we've seen a pattern here.
Oh, absolutely. Dismissing evidence, playing on people's fears, and always positioning himself as the solution.
So as we wrap this up, I'm really curious to get your big picture take on all this. What are the key takeaways, and what should our listeners be keeping in mind moving forward?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway for me is the crucial importance of critical thinking and media literacy. I mean, we're just inundated with information from all sides these days.
Right.
And it's more important than ever to really be discerning about what we're consuming, especially when it's coming from those in positions of authority.
So not just taking things at face value, even if it sounds convincing.
Exactly. We need to be asking ourselves, who's saying this?
Mm-hmm.
What's their angle? Do they have any evidence to back it up? Is there another side to this story?
And beyond just being critical, we also need to be proactive in finding reliable information from trustworthy sources.
Absolutely. There are plenty of reputable news outlets, fact-checking sites, and expert analyses out there. We just have to be willing to put in the effort to find them.
Another big takeaway for me is the power of rhetoric, how the way you frame something can have a huge impact on how people perceive it, even if it's not rooted in reality.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Words have power. And in Trump's case, we've seen how they can be used to manipulate emotions, sow division, and erode trust in institutions.
So what can we do to counter that? How do we make sure facts and evidence win out in a world where rhetoric often seems to rule the day?
It's a challenge, no doubt, but I think it starts with having those tough conversations, even with people we disagree with.
Right.
Engaging in respectful dialogue, challenging misinformation head-on, and promoting critical thinking skills within our communities.
It's about being informed, being engaged, and being willing to speak up for what we believe in.
Precisely, and recognizing that it's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
We need to constantly be learning, adapting, and refining our understanding of the world around us.
Well said. It's been quite a ride unpacking all of this. A huge thanks to our expert for helping us navigate the complexities of Trump's rhetoric and its implications.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you plenty to think about. Remember to stay informed, think critically, and keep those conversations going. This is Le Podcast de Philippe, signing off for now. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video for more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics.